first time I ever went to Las Vegas, I was just passing through. I had to go on a cross-country road trip, and Vegas wasn't too far out of the way from where I was starting, so I figured I could spend the first night there to see what it was all about. Although, because I had more important things to get to, I didn't have plans to get super into the experience per se. I also found out that you had to be 21 to check into all the nice casino hotels, which sucked because I was only 20. This really limited my options in a lot of ways, including the hotels I was able to book. Honestly, to anyone listening, the TLDR to this story is, don't go to Vegas if you're not old enough to drink and gamble. There's really nothing else to do. Anyway, I was traveling with my girlfriend at the time, and when we got there during the day, we went around town and found what we could do to entertain ourselves. Then, for the evening, we walked up and down the strip and gawked at what we were allowed to see without having to show ID. To be fair, it was pretty fun and a good distraction to the headache of the impromptu flight across the country that we were being forced to undertake through extenuating but irrelevant circumstances. But I digress. The real underbelly of Las Vegas reared its ugly head when we went to turn in for the night. The only place I could find anywhere near the strip that would actually allow me to book a room was this stingy, sketchy, scary motel with, no kidding, a sex shop and a strip club across the street. Just walking between my car and the door to my room was a frightful experience on its own. We had a room on the first floor, and the guy above us was smoking a cigarette on the breezeway, staring dead at us the whole time we were getting our bags out of my car. Not to mention, the door had ample evidence that it had been broken into several times. So as soon as my girlfriend and I got in, we jammed it with a rug and a chair, and we threw the deadbolt on the latch. We were pretty wired from going to the strip, so we laid up in bed and watched TV for a while. However, an hour or so later is when things start to get disturbing. The guy in the room above us was extremely loud from the very beginning, stomping around and talking really loud on the phone, constantly moving the chairs around and scraping them against the floor, and generally just rummaging through every possible thing that could make noise. At some point, we heard the door open and they started talking to someone on the breezeway. We couldn't really hear what they were saying, but the conversation quickly developed into a dispute, which became a shouting match. Moments later, the door slammed shut and we heard someone screaming. It sounded like a woman screaming, but it sounded more like she was mad than in peril. I was about to call the police, but then the screaming stopped and it seemed as though they were bringing it back down to a discussion of some kind, and I really wanted to mind my business as much as possible. Of course, we kept listening as these two people went back and forth for several minutes. On multiple occasions, something would be thrown across the room. You could tell it was happening because it made an awful sound when the projectiles hit the ground. Around this time, we were becoming very concerned, and I figured it was a good idea to at least call the front office of the motel, even though I doubted anyone would be working at that hour. Unfortunately, before I even had the time to finish looking up the number, things upstairs got even worse. There was a huge crash, glass shattering followed by the intense thud of bodies hitting the floor. The level of detail of what we could hear was astonishing. It was like I could see each and everything that was happening in the fight that was going on. They were both on the floor, struggling to overpower one another. One of them was grunting and yelling at the other one to shut up while the woman was screaming bloody murder. We can even hear the thuds of them hitting each other. Right away, I abandoned calling the office and I went straight to 911. I reported the active situation to the police, and when I told them the address, they seemed to already know what was happening. They even scolded me a bit and said that I should have called sooner, and honestly, I think they were right. Minutes later, a number of cop cars swarmed the parking lot right in front of my door. My girlfriend and I hid in the bathroom in the back of the motel room in case there was a shootout. The aggressor upstairs noticed the sirens and flashing lights and tried to run away, followed by a whole lot of screaming and shouting by the police. Then suddenly, silence. A little while later, ambulance sirens. Luckily, there was no shots fired. I didn't actually see what happened, but when the cops came knocking on my door to get my statement, I was able to ask them afterwards. Apparently the man we saw in the room above us had ordered a prostitute, but then he didn't have the sufficient funds to pay for the service, so he ended up attempting to rape the woman instead. I didn't ask how far things progressed. I didn't even want to know. I definitely regret not calling sooner, but then again, if I had, he might have found a way to weasel out of getting charged with anything. As it turned out, when he tried to run, he got tased while going down the stairs on the far side of the breezeway. He seized up and fell down a dozen or so steps, then finally cracked his skull open on the pavement. From what I know about the guy, his actions, and his general vibe alone, I bet he deserved that even before doing what he did that night. I used to think those big multi-story hotel buildings, owned by well-known brands, were safer than your typical locally operated one-star motels. That probably is true, statistically, but I've had to come face to face with the fact that anything can happen anywhere. I was on a trip for a family reunion in pretty much the middle of nowhere. The host of the function had a big property, so a lot of family members were staying with them. But I knew I would want my own space to stay in so I could unwind from the stress of having to hang out with my in-laws. There was a small development at the intersection of the two nearest major roads, which, aside from a diner and a gas station and a Dollar General, didn't have much except a disproportionately large hotel chain. It was the only real hotel for miles, so it was surprisingly booked up, especially with the other members of my family that had the same idea. On the morning of the first day, after leaving my house before dawn to make the 3-hour drive in good time, I checked into my room before going to the reunion. I remember seeing a lot of people milling around in the lobby, taking part in the continental breakfast and talking with the front desk. But one guy sitting in a chair by himself in the middle of it all stuck out like a sore thumb. He was older and kind of frail looking, but not exactly elderly, just like he'd never really taken care of himself. His hair was wild and wispy, and his eyes were blankly staring into the distance. That was until I made the mistake of making eye contact with him. Then his expression suddenly became super intense, like a crazy person when you can tell there's something messed up going on inside their brain. I immediately felt my stomach do a somersault, so I looked away and pretended I couldn't tell he was hard staring at me for the rest of the time I was in the lobby. After I checked in with the desk, I went up to my room and unpacked, then mentally prepared myself for the day before heading out. Of course, as I was leaving, I made note of the fact that he hadn't moved from his seat, and once again, he stared me down as I was walking out of the building. Over the course of the day, however, with everything that happened, I totally forgot about him. I left the hotel at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I didn't get back until 10 o'clock at night. Unfortunately, I was stopped in my tracks as soon as I stepped back in the lobby. The first thing I saw was that same creepy old man, sitting in the same exact seat as 12 hours ago, but this time, he had it rotated to face the entrance, as if he had been intentionally watching everyone come through the door all day long. When he saw me, a disturbing grin appeared on his face, and he started to stand up. I tried to ignore him, and I walked as quickly as I could to the elevator. But while I was forced to wait for it to arrive, he was able to catch up. That's when I noticed just how bad this guy smelled. He really didn't take care of himself at all, and after apparently not moving from that seat for the whole day, he was stewed in his own stench. I had to hold my breath when I finally got in the elevator because, of course, he followed me and didn't press the button for his own floor. When he felt like he had me cornered, he tried to make small talk. "Long day?" he asked. "Yep," I said as shortly as possible. "Traveling for business?" he asked again, taking a small step closer. "Family," I replied. Then I added something for good measure. "They're actually staying in the hotel with me." Unfortunately, this didn't seem to faze him. He just stared blankly and said nothing. Finally, the doors opened and let us out. I expected him to try and follow me to my room the second I saw him, so I'd actually pressed the button of the floor above mine. I basically power walked to the nearest stairwell and went down a story, then slipped into my room. He wasn't able to keep up with me, and luckily, he didn't see me as I went inside, so I figured by then that I was in the clear. I had a bottle of sparkling grape juice that I'd taken from the reunion as a little treat for myself, but since it had warmed up during transport, I stepped out to get a bucket of ice so it could chill while I took a shower. I didn't see anybody in the hallway at first, so I relaxed a little bit. I had to mess with the ice machine for a minute to get it to work, but I was eventually able to get a bucket. But when I turned around, that creep was standing right behind me. My spirit left my body. I was completely dumbfounded that he was able to sneak up on me. He was grinning victoriously too, which just made me sick. "What are you running away for?" he said, gradually inching his way closer and closer. "I'm not going to hurt you, I swear. I just want a taste." Those were the exact words that he said. They made me throw up in my own mouth. He started reaching out his hand to touch me, so I threw the entire bucket of ice in his face and broke out into a full sprint down the hallway, frantically opening my door and slamming it shut, throwing every lock I could. He was several seconds behind me. Again, I was thankful that he was extremely out of shape. but the fact that I literally ran for dear life in the other direction was of consequence to him. I could see the shadow of his feet underneath the door, and I noticed the moment the light from the hallway stopped coming through the peephole. I knew he would have just stayed there and watched me all night if he were given the chance. I held back the urge to confront him and instead called the front desk to tell him what was happening. A few minutes later, the nighttime desk employee came up to the hallway and made him go to his own room. I had trouble sleeping that night for obvious reasons, so for the next night of the reunion, I checked out early, bit the bullet, and stayed with my family instead. Anything was preferable to dealing with that old creep stalking me. I was traveling solo through the Scottish Highlands, driving a rental car from London all the way to Mallaig, one of the northernmost towns in the country. Ever since I'd gone there with my family as a kid, I always wanted to go back as an adult and see everything on my own terms. This was at the beginning of what was supposed to be a backpacking trip across Europe, but because of what happened, I never made it off the British island before going back to America with my tail between my legs. By the first evening on the road, I'd made it well into the Highlands, and since I was sightseeing, I decided not to drive in the dark. Once the sun started to set, I stopped at a random inn on the side of the road. From what I saw, inns in the region are a lot different than your typical American hotel. Everyone I saw once I got into Scotland had a very homey vibe to it, and the one I decided to stay at was pretty much indistinguishable from the rest. Instead of a cheap breakfast, they had their own pub on the ground floor where they served homemade food and house draughts at various times of the day, which I'd arrive in time to partake in for some dinner. Since I was alone, I sat at the bar and I had a chat with some old folks who had me pegged for a tourist before I even opened my mouth. They recommended some places to see along my way, along with their favorite meals and ales, which I duly ordered from the innkeeper. A middle-aged woman came around to greet me. This is also when I paid for my room for the night. It was all very casual and relaxed. A great atmosphere for wary travelers and a brand of hospitality that the Scots seemed proud to provide. By the time I finished my beef stew and a pint of beer, all the other guests in the pub had gone to their rooms for the night, which left me mostly alone, aside from the innkeeper who was keeping me company while the cook was cleaning up in the kitchen. Apparently, since the sun sets so late in the summer, most people in the Highlands are accustomed to going to bed with the sun still setting. But I wasn't used to this, and it was keeping me up, despite the food coma that I was slipping into after eating so much food. I talked with the innkeeper about it, and they suggested we have a few drinks to solve this problem. I obliged, and they offered me shots from a bottle of Scottish liquor that I'd never seen before. I was a bit surprised, as when they said drinks, I figured that it would be more beer, but I wasn't going to offend them by declining. They gave me a tall glass of water to chase it with, but the innkeeper didn't get one for themselves, which made me feel like a wimp. Over the course of the next hour or so, I probably had 3 or 4 shots of that stuff. Obviously, my recollection from this point on is less than reliable, but I've had a lot of time to think about this day. They just kept feeding me liquor as fast as I could drink it. I was guzzling the water too. Once it was finally dark outside, I said to the innkeeper that I was finally ready to turn in, but as soon as I stood up, I realized that something was very wrong. Not only was I drunker than I wanted to be, like way drunker, but I felt like I was more than drunk. I looked at the innkeeper and tried to speak, but I couldn't. The words came out as gibberish. The cook was done in the kitchen and standing next to them too. He was a brute, just standing there with his arms crossed. I remember one of them saying that it looked like I needed help getting to my room as I walked away. I tried going for the door to get to my car, but the cook caught up to me and blocked my way, forcing me to turn around. Together, the two of them corralled me and my belligerents to the center of the building, where there was a staircase with one way leading up to the second floor where all the rooms were and the other one heading down into the cellar. I paused there, thinking the extreme cloudiness of my brain in the moment that there was no way I was making it up those stairs. However, that was the last thought I had before I felt a hard blow to my back as I was pushed down the stairs. The impact at the bottom left me unconscious, which was the end of me for many hours. I woke up in the morning finding myself in the back seat of my car, nowhere near the inn. My head was pounding and my abdomen was in intense shooting pain. I looked down and found a roughly sutured wound on my left side. My heart sank as I realized what happened. I had just been harvested for one of my kidneys. My mind started racing for ways to get the people responsible, but the more that I came to, the more I realized my situation was hopeless. I'd been knocked out early in the night through a combination of excessive alcohol, a concussion, along with what I'm almost positive was some sort of sedative laced into that glass of water I'd had after dinner. That gave those people hours to harvest my kidney, then load my unconscious body into the back seat of my car under the cover of darkness, and drive me many miles down the road so that I would never be able to remember which one of the dozens of extremely similar inns I had gone to. My memory of the evening was so hazing from the drugging that even though I could remember a vague description of the cook and the innkeeper, and I can even remember some of our conversation, I have literally no solid memory of the names or faces of anyone that I met that night, especially after eating dinner, which makes me think there was something in the beef stew too. Speaking of, I'm lucky I didn't have a reaction to the sedative and choke on my own vomit with all the food that was in my stomach while I was under. Worse still, this was before the time that rental cars were equipped with GPS, so there was basically no way of being able to backtrack, especially since they dumped me far off the course that I was taking. I'd also been robbed of all my luggage, including my wallet and cell phone. Delirious and distraught, I had no choice but to slowly drive my way back onto a main road where I flagged down the first passerby I could and asked them to call the police. I gave them all the information I could, then I asked to be taken to the station where I began the slow, painful, and disheartening journey back home, 2 months before I'd initially planned to do so. As far as I know, those people who seem to have quite the black market organ harvesting operation on their hands have never been apprehended.